But
So
maybe let's kick it off with that maybe. Hi everyone, welcome to the third Heroes of Data Roundtable. So in this episode, it's your hosts. It's me, Sara. I work with marketing at Validio, deep data observability platform, and we also have Krochmal, who is a data engineer. And with us today, we have two very special guests. I'm going to let you, Annika and Rebecka, introduce yourselves. Annika, do you want to go first?
Sure. I am Annika. I'm an analytics engineer at Mentimeter, the audience engagement platform. I've been an analytics engineer for about a year. And before that, I worked as a data scientist also at Mentimeter and other places in like various versions of BI analyst, data analyst, and the more or less descriptive titles. And I have a background in political science, which is very untechnical among all the data engineers.
Very cool. Thanks for being here. And Rebecka, who are you?
Yes. Who am I? That's a good question. My background is in data science and machine learning. I used to work at Excel for many years in a lot of different data roles, eventually leading the machine learning team for a couple of years. I've also been at Tink for a while as head of data and analytics, but these days I run my own startup where we build the startup is called Peach, and we build a data platform as a service. So still in the data space, but in a very different role.
Super cool. And we're so happy to have both of you. And we're very excited to have this conversation that we have planned today with you. Yi, do you want to kick us off and kind of share a little bit the topic for today?
Yeah, absolutely. So the topic for today is something along the lines of when people decide that they need a lot and maybe they don't. This comes from a totally not real world example at all, which is completely theoretical, in which I or someone who looks exactly like me may have been asked to implement Lambda architecture with streaming set up next to batch processing, and because it's what Netflix do. And at the time, our entire database was about 20,000 rows of data, which is, maybe not Netflix data size. And our entire team of analysts was me, also one of two data engineers, which is also not exactly Netflix staffing, which is kind of, brought this to our attention, is that maybe this is something that happens. Maybe this isn't something that happened to someone who looked exactly like me. So I'll just turn it over, and Annika and Rebecka, whoever wants to go first, do you guys have any examples ever of any company ever doing something like this?
Yes.
I might have heard about it.
But I will say, I don't think I've been asked to implement a very specific solutions or problem, but definitely I think the requests we want streaming data. Why is the data not completely up to date? Why don't we instantly see it in our dashboards? I think that is a request that probably every single person working with data has at some point gotten. So yeah, I can very much relate, but maybe more from a functional perspective than the details of how to build.
Okay. Most of my experience are along the line, more data science-y. I read all the buzz articles around do black magic with something artificial intelligence, something machine learning. Can we do this? Can you predict the future accurately with all these magical data things? It's no, because we don't even record what we do.
Okay, you don't even record what you do, but you want to know about the future. So let's just get into that then. Why do you think someone makes a request like that from you?
I think part of the reason is there's this huge hype around data in general, right? I think a lot of companies are feeling that they must invest in data because data is the new oil, it's the future. If we don't do this, we'll fall behind. And I think the fact that companies are kind of excited about doing data for the sake of doing data is, I guess, a big part of the problem. I think the companies that are actually successful in working with data and that do it really well, I think those are the ones that realize this is a means to an end, not the end itself. But I think requests like that often come from the sort of hype effect of data world right now.
Was that the case when you were asked about streaming? If we double click a little bit on your example there, or if you have other ones, but what?
No, not really. I think the streaming one is quite interesting because I think as I can't like even count the number of times I've gotten this one, like, you know, stakeholders kind of wondering why is the data delayed? Like, why can't I see it immediately? And I think it's a very valid question. I think it's a reasonable thing to ask. I think as a data person, I think very often you'll just say, no, you can't. Sorry, doesn't work that way. But I guess the real reason is it's just so much more complex to build streaming systems. So most of the time it doesn't make sense. The value doesn't sort of make up for the effort that would be involved. So I think the correct answer in most cases is no, you can't get it live or streaming. But I think like from a business perspective, it's a very valid question. Like, why can't I see this instantly? And I guess like our challenge as data people is to explain that and explain the complexity. And ideally also try to understand like, why do they want it? Because sometimes I think they might want it for good reasons. Like, you know, there's like a product launch and you want to like live track the performance of the product. Are things going as expected? Or are users struggling with signing up and stuff like that? Sometimes I think it's for really bad reasons. Like if you're tracking a metric, like, I don't know, monthly active users, like it's not going to matter if you see that data updated like every second or minute or hour or probably even day. So I can't say anything generally about whether they're good or bad requests, but I think they're worth taking seriously, even though I think 99.9% of the time the answer will be no, you're not going to get streaming data.
Yeah.
So how do you assess then? You went into a little bit here that you try to ask some follow-up questions and try to explain that possibly the value that the stakeholder in question will probably gain is probably much less than, you know, what we would put in. But how do you then as a data professional go about assessing that value from the stakeholder?
It's a good question. I think I just try to ask questions back. So like, okay, that's a relevant request. Like, why do you want that? Or like, what's your intended use case? How would you see yourselves using this? Or like, what is it that you're trying to do that doesn't work with a current setup? But then very often I eventually end up just explaining kind of the complexity of building streaming systems and explaining how it's probably not going to be worth it. Even if it would create value for them, it's not going to be enough to warrant the effort.
I think that's has worked very well in the past for us, or my experience explaining the complexity and like the cost associated with it, like both monetary, but also in terms of work hours spent that are not spent on something else. Like you can't have that, not because it's impossible, but like this is what it takes. These are the things that we then won't do. Do you really want it if this is the trade-off? And then the answer usually is no, then I don't want it.
Right, so I have that experience as well.
Right, sorry.
This kind of binary, right? Either I explain it to the stakeholder that this is what it takes, and then they realize, oh, hey, I do only check that dashboard, you know, every Tuesday, and I don't really care if it's fresh. Or it's the other way around, that they have some, no, but I manage incidents where I absolutely need real-time data. I just absolutely need it. But I think my question, if we go dig a little deeper into that, like, is there ever a case where there's like a gray zone where you would have to assess, like, this is what it would take and this is the actual value? Like, do we as data professionals ever really put a quantified value that the thing brings, or do we just try to get to yes or no?
I do it all the time. I think we got pretty good at this at iSettle in the machine learning team. We would literally, like, when we were considering sort of which projects to take on, we would literally estimate like the value in money that they would bring. This sometimes felt weird to be talking about money all the time, but I think it was a really useful exercise. So we were a centralized machine learning team, meaning we got sort of requests from different parts of the business that worked on completely different things. They were all like optimizing some metric that they cared about. And in most cases, I think they were great metrics, but then we had to kind of figure out, okay, should we work on project A that improves, I don't know, MAUs by some number, or project B that improves like average revenue per user by some other number? And then we had to kind of translate everything into like a least common denominator, and that ends up quickly being money. So we did that very often, and we tried to also estimate kind of the cost of us doing it. So there was both like a relative prioritization exercise, like project A versus B, but also like, is it worth doing it all? Is the value enough to warrant the effort? But we did feel kind of lonely in doing that. We realized that most teams don't.
Did it take a lot of time to make the estimates?
Yes and no. Yes, it's something we allocated significant time to. I think that was time well spent because it prevented us from taking on the wrong projects that wouldn't like create enough value. But also no, because I think we learned how to do it sort of relatively quickly. I mean, didn't need to be like super detailed and super accurate. Most of the time, like a back of an envelope kind of calculation was enough.
Annika, do you have, I know you've been part of kind of deciding on tooling and things like that. Do you have similar experiences of like evaluating options that maybe are not necessarily monetary?
Not in that detail. Like I'm super fascinated hearing that this is something that data teams can do. And to me, that feels like an example of this sounds great, but Menti, where I'm working now, is too small, or up until very recently has been too small that makes sense. And now we're moving into the size where we should start thinking about it like this. And before, if you have a data team of like 5-6 people, making these calculations already is time you don't have. Even back of the envelope.
Do you agree, Rebecka?
Yes and no. I see what you mean. It's like hard to do any of this if you don't have good sort of metrics in place, if you don't have reasonable instrumentation and stuff like that. So yes. On the other hand, I do think it's like time well spent if you make sure to kind of down scope it so you don't spend days on making these estimates. If it's truly like a back of the envelope, then I think it's usually like time well spent because it prevents you from working on the wrong things. My experience is like gut feeling is often wrong on which projects are like valuable.
Oh, do you have
I have like an interesting, I do have, or maybe not on whether it was valuable or not, but we did at ICETL, we did a huge project. It was mainly one of my colleagues in my team that was working on this, but it was a huge project that involved many teams and many people, basically replacing a bunch of rules that were used to flag fraudulent cases or suspected cases of fraud in payments. We were replacing that with a machine learning model. And we obviously, argued, okay, we're going to get better accuracy and like we'll basically catch more fraudsters and we'll save money off of that. And it was true. There was like a positive effect of doing that, but it was completely dwarfed by the effect of having fewer false positives. So like the effect, so basically what happens if you flag too many is like ICETL would like reach out to people and say, hey, something like weird is going on in your account. Can you kind of help us understand? Can you explain yourself? And like then there would be a process that could lead to the user being banned, or it could just be like an unpleasant experience for the user that does not end up with them being banned. They just feel like they were accused of something kind of. And that obviously sometimes leads to churn. And what she concluded when working on this was basically that effect was like, I don't even know how much bigger, but like I think an order of magnitude bigger than the effect of like improved precision or like, So there was some effect of like reducing missed cases of fraud, and we kind of saved some money on that. But the big effect came from like less often reaching out to users who had actually done nothing wrong and kind of causing them to churn. So I think that was surprising. No one was expecting that. And we also thought like time saved would be an important component, and it was not. Like the sort of reduced churn was like by far the biggest one.
So it's kind of
that was unintuitive, and we would not have known if we hadn't sort of gone through the exercise of like estimating all these variables.
So going back to why this happens, because according to this kind of model of explanation, comparing costs to benefit, that seems like the sort of thing that business stakeholders do all day, every day. Why is it that process somehow seems to kind of fail when it comes to data? Is it because it's new? Is it because it's so very hype? Or what do you think is the driving mechanism behind that failing here specifically?
This was exactly the question I wanted to ask also. We're so synced.
Boom.
I think it comes back to what we talked about in the beginning. It is so hyped that if you don't know the details and just go by the hype, the outcome, the value is easily exaggerated because it's this like cool black magic thing that gives me all the definite answers that are definitely correct because it's now data-based and not gut feeling based. And if I can have this like magic ball that will definitely tell me what is happening, that has immense value. But unfortunately, that's the hype and not the reality.
Right. So where do you think the business stakeholders get these ideas from? Like, do they sit and skim Medium articles all day and just read the headlines, or like how do they come to these conclusions? Where does the hype appear?
LinkedIn. Medium articles, like
ChatGPT posts on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
LinkedIn.
There was some hype before ChatGPT though.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know. I think it's a great question. I think it's something that is like built up over a long time and hard to like pinpoint to a very specific thing. I do think there are some like really good success stories out there of companies that like truly got a lot of value from data, or that companies that have kind of made data core to their business and getting like immense value from it. I think Google is a great example of that. Like so many of their products would be like useless if it weren't for all the data that they sit on. And thanks to that, they're amazing and very hard to compete with. I don't know, like Google Maps, I think is one of those examples. If they didn't have all that data on sort of, you know, where people go and when and traffic and stuff, it wouldn't be anywhere near as useful. And I think that causes other companies to think, okay, we want that. How do we get that? So maybe like seeing those success stories, but I think they're like relatively rare. I don't think there's that many companies that are like wildly successful in using data, but since there are a few that really are wildly successful, I think that creates inspiration.
Yeah, that's probably true. So I have one reflection and one question.
Sorry.
No, you go first, Annika. Then I can do my
I mean, those success stories don't just exist in a vacuum. Like, because data is hype, there's an entire industry around telling business owners or decision makers, if you just buy my service, just buy my SaaS, just hire me, I will give you the same value out of your data. And it is really easy if you just buy my SaaS, the one-stop solution for all your data problems.
Marketing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Evil stuff.
But I think that came later.
Yes.
I do think that's like a contributing factor, but I think the hype was like there way before all this like this huge abundance of tools appeared.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think it's
and I feel that is how the business side like learns or like gets the ideas of this is all very easy and gives me all their value, because that's what I find in their LinkedIn mailbox, and they think, oh, but I don't need that SaaS. I have an in-house data team that will surely do the exact same thing that the salesperson just promised to me.
For sure. So I have, like I said, I have one reflection and one question to kind of flip things around maybe a little bit. So the first thing is I heard a colleague say this week, like, you will be delegated to the person that you sound like. So if you sound like you are like a C-level executive, you will be kind of, oh, you should probably talk to this person. And because the way that like the business world works and has worked for a number of years, like the way any project is evaluated or should be evaluated in theory is with a business case, like exactly what you explained, Rebecka. So if from the data team you don't talk in terms of business cases, you will have trouble connecting with the business side of the company. And I think this is like tying back to the entire reason for why we're doing this roundtable, you know, trying to bridge that gap. So I think there's like a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. And like, if you don't speak the business case language, you will contribute to that divide. So that's like my reflection. And then the question that I have then, like against this backdrop is, you know, we've talked now, we've kind of portrayed the business user as this idea, this person that is very visionary and gets inspiration from like LinkedIn and all the buzz. And then they like bring that to the data team and they're like, can we do this? Can we talk about the cases where it's actually the data team that wants to do something really, really, really cool and ends up doing that, even though it's not something that they need or are ready for? I will let you comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, that obviously happens a lot, I think, unfortunately.
What are some examples that you've seen?
I don't want to like point fingers on this question. I don't know what to use as an example. No, but I do think generally it's like really common. And I think this is maybe common for like engineers or like builders, because I don't want to limit it to just engineers. I think it might as well be like analysts, for example. But like people who have this urge to like build things typically end up being great builders. But then I think you get stuck in this urge to like build perfect things or build great things and build things that are future-proof and build things that scale. And very often I think that's unnecessary. I don't think this is specific to data. I think this happens all the time, everywhere. It's not a new like topic or question, but it's just hard. It's hard to strike the balance between building things well and not overbuilding or over engineering things you are building. I think that's just a common trap to fall into.
I think another aspect of the trap is that everything data moves very fast. So there's always new shiny toys that you want to play with if this is your field, because that's the fun bit. That's why we're all here. But unfortunately, the new shiny toys often isn't what the business actually needs.
Sad.
Definitely.
Yes.
All right,
but I think
yeah.
this is actually an interesting topic, I think, because I really agree. Like, I think most, like 99% of like cool toys that come out are like worthless and not going to be useful. But I also think, and I've said this like so many times, I think it's super, super important if you're like a data person or working in the data field that you stay on top of like what's going on and what's happening, like, because things move so quickly. So I think it's still important to try them out, like even if they're not valuable to your company. So like, I think there's a bunch of good ways of doing this. I think my favorite is doing something like lab days or hack days or hack weeks, where you like allocate time to basically playing and say like, this is money well spent or time well spent for the company, because it's how we keep up to date. And once in a while, we'll stumble across something that's actually useful for us, but we're not going to limit ourselves to only exploring things that we know will be useful. Like, this is the time for playing. Because I agree, that's also my experience. 99% is useless, but still like worth exploring so that you stay on top and up to date.
So what's the answer?
Completely agree.
Do we try to speak business case in this case as well? Because I assume the kind of normal life cycle for this kind of thing would be engineer sees shiny toy, engineer suggests shiny toy, business says, what's the value? And there it kind of dies. But if we're all agreed that what's the value is the key question to always ask, how come we forget to ask it on both sides of this fence? Is it because we're dummies?
I don't necessarily think we forgot to ask it. I mean, I think I'm not going to claim that this is how it's always worked like perfectly in all the places I've been, but in general, I think the sort of recipe to success has been like allocate time for playing, and then the rest of the time we're like fairly strict about what work we take on, and we only take on things that we're fairly certain to make sense. But then you have this like playing time that you do whatever you want with.
But if we agree that the situation happens, that sometimes people do go on wild goose chases on both sides of this fence, then obviously sometimes someone forgets to ask themselves or each other this question: what's the value? Do we need to go by that always? What's the value? Should that be the only, like, it should be like the slogan on the wall: live, love, dance, what's the value?
I think there's a part to that, actually, because I think those two cases depend, like where the idea comes from, are different in one very important aspect, which is, I think, the knowledge gap. So if the three of you would tell me, I mean, I know a little bit about data, I'm very interested and I've worked with it, but I'm not a practitioner in the sense that you are. If you tell me, Sarah, we need to implement a streaming architecture, like we need that, it's not going to work if we don't, like, who am I to say, like, what's the value? You know, I will trust your recommendation. So that's a very different thing versus if I say, oh, like, Rebecka, can we do streaming architecture? And then you can sit me down and you can explain, yes, we could do streaming architecture, but it would cost all of these things. This is how many hours, la, la, la. You can explain that to me and I'm going to be, you know, like, okay, you're right. It doesn't really make sense. And what the implication of that, I think, is if I am a business stakeholder, I will trust the data team to a certain point. But if I have been waiting and they are telling me that all of these things are really important, but then no value comes out in the end, then that trust will be lost. And I'm going to just delegate the data team to, like, oh yeah, they do things, but I don't know.
And I sadly think, like, exactly what you're describing, I think is like sadly quite common. But I think that's like over trusting. I don't think you should trust your data team when they say we need this, period. Like, just trust us, we need it. I really don't think you should. You should like insist on asking why, or like what will happen, what will we get, or what will we like miss out on if we don't build thing X that you're suggesting. But I think the other side of it is also not only like digging into the why, which I think business stakeholders should, But it's also like, I guess, some level of accountability. And this, again, I think comes back to the monetary value thing. That was always really important for me, especially after I became a manager, because I was like, if someone comes up to me and says, hey, Rebecka, like, what value does your team bring? Like, you know, I always like envisioned, you know, like poor times where, you know, the company is trying to cut costs. And I guess sadly is what's starting to happen now. But like, this was many years ago, not likely to happen. But it was really important to me that I would have like a good answer. If someone says like, why shouldn't we just like cut out your entire team? Like what will happen if we do? Like what value do they actually bring? I wanted to like always have an answer ready to that question. And I think that's important. I think even if you don't get asked it, you should have that answer. And I think it doesn't just apply to like managers. I think as an individual, you should be able to answer that question. I think it's really, really important. Like what value do you actually bring? Not like, oh, I build X, Y, and Z, but like what happens if those things aren't built? Like why is that valuable to the company?
Okay, so I guess final question goes to Annika. You've been musing a little bit here. Seeing all of this, and if you do agree that there is a kind of a power, an asymmetrical distribution of power here when it comes to knowledge, how come, or rather, let me phrase it like this. Do you trust the business back? If the business trusts your expertise and you expect them to, Rebecka says they shouldn't, do you trust Sara when she says, I need this real time? Is that your initial position?
My initial, I think that brings us back to the first conversation we had. You ask questions back. My initial reaction or position is, yes, you definitely think you need this. Let's get to the root of why you think that, and then I might agree or disagree.
Yeah.
What problem are you actually trying to solve?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, may I've been taking some notes here. May I do an attempt at summarizing a little bit our you know, key takeaways for the session? So essentially, how do you prevent building things you don't need or doing things that you shouldn't do? I think my first bullet here is to educate people and to try and nuance the success stories and the hype a little bit and explain kind of what's the real thing behind here. Then number 2, to assess the value, ideally in money or some other comparable term, and that gut feeling is probably wrong. And then 3rd, I wrote to be honest with yourself, but also to keep others honest, like asking people, making sure you really understand. Would you say that, Annika and Rebecka, would you say we captured the main points?
Yes, definitely. Good summary.
Fantastic. All right. Cool. I think that's it. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Do you have any like final bits that you would like to add to the conversation before we wrap it up? Okay, but thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Having us.
Thanks,
Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Same.
Bye.